Okay, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, and a personal thank you to Professor Parcu, Botta, and Chiara Carrozza for giving me the opportunity to introduce this event that will conclude. This is the last seminar that the Florence School of Regulation organized in order to discuss the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic over our digital economies. During the last month, everybody got to realize the importance of being and keeping on connected to a network in order to carry on his own working and social activities, including schooling. In essence, everybody has realized that connection to a network is the backbone of our lives. Today's topic is in line with his main concern, with the main discussion, because today we are going to discuss about mobile connectivity. Everybody is envisaging a story of success for the 5G technology. Today, with the support of real experts, we'll discuss some issues related to the use of this technology in response to the pandemic, and we'll see whether or not COVID-19 has been actually changing something or not, and what to expect in our next future. I'm very pleased, actually I'm thrilled, to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Professor Antonio Nishita, a very well-known economist with an invaluable regulatory expertise. Up to last September, he was a board member. He was a member of the Commission Board of the Italian Communications Regulatory Authority, AGCOM, where, among others, he was responsible of some key, very important regulatory decision for today's panel. Among others, I can quote the sector inquiries on machine-to-machine or on big data. So I think that Antonio is the right person to explain us the digital ecosystem evolution. Then we have Professor Michael Gall from IFA University, one of the most important antitrust scholars worldwide, that will explain us the importance of data ecosystems and their implications for competition in the digital market. Lastly, we have Dr. Johan Ketelan that will tell us Facebook view on connectivity, and on the basis of his expertise in both regulatory and antitrust sectors, he can point us to the most important issues. At the end of the speaker's presentation that will last around 10 minutes each, we'll have some spare time for a Q&A session from the floor. So please, you are kindly requested to submit your question in writing in the chat. Please remember to address the question to both all panelists and all attendees so that we can all see your questions. Finally, as a gentle reminder, please mute your audio, so switch off your audio. I think I have already spoken too much, and so I can leave the floor to Antonio, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the presentation. I decided to briefly focus on three main points related to the discussions that we will have today. But starting from a general view on what has been done in Europe and also in Italy, of course, in terms of granting connectivity during the COVID pandemic. Few days ago, the BEREC board has published a report related to the way in which traffic streams and connectivity have performed over these months. And while, generally speaking, in almost all the countries, we had substantial good performance on average on both mobile and fixed telecommunications, on the other side, we have experienced it, and Italy, unfortunately, is one of these countries, we have experienced also the relevance of the digital divide that we still have, especially between very dense urban areas and all the other areas. For instance, the Italian regulator has calculated that almost from 10 to 40% of students were not connected with the school during the past months. At the same time, in Italy, we have calculated approximately about 128 or 132 small cities that are, we have called that completely white, both from the point of view of fixed line connection, but also from the point of view of mobile connections. These are very small towns, but still there are people there. And so we have to do all that we can do in the next few years, also under the background of the Next Generation EU, in order to further increase coverage of both mobile and fixed connection, in order to reduce digital divide and also to enhance social inclusion, especially after the COVID experience. This allows me also to say that indeed 5G, the 5G world, the 5G ecosystem, the 5G perspective is very important in this respect. In this, first of all, because in this period we had in Europe with different starts, we have that almost all the countries have now designed spectrum for 5G. Italy was one of the first, and several operators started making investments in order to implement the network infrastructure related to 5G. 5G will be crucially important, not only for just the citizen users of standard telecommunications, but also especially for new services, which are very important in terms, for instance, of what is now being called medtech. So all the connectivity related to health that can improve precisely what we are going to do under the pandemic, which means contact and be connected with people with disease while isolating them from contagion. So this is a very important paradigm for 5G development, and several of the investments that different countries, and Italy is one of these countries, are now trying to boost for the Next Generation EU, clearly put the 5G at the center of a new digital strategy for connectivity. In this respect, what we are registering very recently, and I will be very happy to understand what Johan will tell us about that, we have that we are going to develop a 5G ecosystem in two main domains. The first domain is what we can call the traditional 5G ecosystem, which has to do, with all the development of standard essential patents and the ability for these new patents to be spread not only in the standard sector industries, but in all other sectors. And this normally is called as the problem of verticals, so that now you have several sectors trying to implement 5G connection for users that are not the traditional users of connectivity. And this is the first ecosystem discussion related to 5G. The second system of discussions has to do with what is called the virtual 5G, and has to do with the development of all the possible communication, business case, business use, interoperable uses related, for instance, to connectivity from home or relative to an environment in which you have different domains of choices, of data, of communications put together to the benefits of citizens. And these two different systems have in common one main issue, that is the issue of standardization, interoperability, and openness to different stakeholders in the market. So going into the first ecosystem, what I see personally is that we need to solve, and there have been several seminars at the Florence School of Regulation on this point. We need to solve the many conflicts that we have experienced also in terms of antitrust for defining what should be access to standard essential patent on the one side, what means in that respect fair uses and fair friend prices in a context in which verticals and new sectors raise a new issue, that is what should be the right level of licensing and what should be the right level of friend pricing relative to that. Just very recently, a famous case that is around in Germany, which is the Nokia Daimler-Benz case, has been delivered to the court for a referral relative to some questions precisely on the point I mentioned. And what I think is that industry should evolve in that respect in order not to increase antitrust litigation, because this could be really detrimental for innovation and for certainty in terms of innovation and property rights. So we need to define clearly what will be the standardization, access and friend prices in a context, in a complex context in which now we have multiple new stakeholders with multiple level of uses. For instance, once in the past, the issue of pricing, for instance, was related to the end user, so that at the end the royalties for a 4G patent was actually based on the price of the final device used by the final user. Now, if you think to cars, if you think to any device that could be used in terms of Internet of Things, it's not clear at what level the patent should be accessed and what kind of price should be. And I think that the way of facing all these issues just through the antitrust lens, it's bad and it is not correct, because what we need is to provide certainty in this respect. So I think that some sort of self-regulation, co-regulation activity that may clarify what the rules of the game are should be introduced somehow. This leads me to the second point that has to do with the new ecosystem that comes, for instance, when we talk about Internet of Things, IoT, and smart home, and whatever. We have to imagine there that in the same environment, you have different domains that needs to talk to each other. You have the domain that is relative to wireline access, the domain relative to wireless access, and the domain relative to data center, data connection, data storage, and whatever. And then you have the stream of information and commercial contracts that you need also to put together. So how in this environment, all the different stakeholders will talk to each other, will set a standards, will grant an open environment without monopolizing also this new ecosystem that is mostly based on IoT. Of course, 5G, what 5G allows us is to have a huge amount of information that is delivered in a very short time, and also allows to storage data center in a more efficient way. But what we need to build is an ecosystem for which the different stakeholders that are called to manage transactions in the IoT environment can work together without creating barriers to entry, so that we cannot have in that kind of ecosystem sort of first mover advantage by some platform over the other, or by some actor over the other. And this is an open issue. It has been raised very recently, and I think that some focal point in terms of also very light regulation or co-regulation should be pushed. I think on the lines precisely in which we have experienced the cooperation and standardization for the production of SEPs. So I mean, inviting shareholders to put together an effort to come together with a final decision. In this respect, and I'm going to conclude this short introduction, in this respect, another important point is related to data center and data management. Here we have a huge new issues, because when we talk about Internet of Things or smart home, we are not precisely in the same contractual environment as the one that we have, in my view, when we are talking about standard uses covered by GDPR. What I mean here is that while there are situations in which the economic transaction, it's clear, so that when we decided to give our consent, it is clear what kind of uses and what kind of transactions we have in mind. In the IoT environment, precisely because we have so many different actors playing together in the same ecosystem, it is not necessarily clear what is the transaction behind the data stream. And this is why I think that some of these matters are much more covered by the e-privacy directive rather than by GDPR. But here, one point that could come under discussion, and I just put this as an idea, is to take stock of some of the ideas that have been introduced in a new, different environment, that is the Data Governance Act produced by the European Commission. Now, that act is related to data that are under mainly under the domain of public services, but that are covered somehow by interests or rights of third parties. So this is not precisely the case of IoT, but there is a nice idea that has been introduced there, which is the ideas of introducing intermediaries for data management. That means introducing new agents that can help to create an environment which is more competitive, more transparent, and somehow more under the control of the owner of the data, which is the ownership of citizen. So this is one idea I would like to put in the discussion, and also ask to my colleagues what they think about that. If, for instance, an idea of data intermediary is needed, for instance, in terms of data management under the IoT environment, or whether this could further complicate an environment which is already complex. Because I think that one possible discussion there should be, for instance, when I have many services in my house under IoT, if there is just one stakeholder that is managing all the transactions that refers to my all the services that I raised, this could help enhancing transparency and also reducing transactions costs. But on the other side, we should be sure that who is doing this job is not vertically integrated in such a way that could transform this activity in an activity that further enhance or create a first mover advantage or potential dominance in new emerging markets. So to conclude this the first part, I think that the new ecosystem of the 5G that we really expect to be developed, especially under the post-COVID crisis, is an environment in which we need to shape new rules. New rules, I mean, in terms of rules of conduct, not necessarily in terms of regulation. And we need to be very clear on the rules of the game, because we need to create an environment which is maintained to be competitive, open, and transparent. Precisely because we have many different systems there, and we have many different interests there, coming from public utilities to access to consumption patterns of goods, and so on and so forth. So I think that discussion in this respect is very useful, and some reaction at the European level will be needed sooner or later in terms of defining what should be cooperation in the 5G for IoT. Enhancing also virtual 5G in the terms that Johan will tell us later.
Thank you very much, Professor Nishita. You raised a lot of interesting arguments that I think Mikael will build upon. Please, Mikael, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel and many wonderful points. I want to take a different angle and start and focus on competitive effects of 5G and whether competition law has any role there that might be interesting. So first of all, what does 5G bring about? It brings about, of course, faster and cheaper connectivity, which enables better ability to connect data from different sources. Now, what might be the competitive effects of such a technology? Of course, the main effect is to create better sharing or synergies of data. And they are, of course, extremely important because there are significant benefits in voluminous data. The size and the quality of data affects the knowledge that can be mined from it. And one way to think about it, which I really like, comes from Mayer Schoenberger and Padua, which observed that the value of data can be greatly enhanced by combining it together with other data sources. And so each data piece, you can think about it like a single puzzle piece that taken by itself offers little value, but when combined with other pieces of data, can complete an image and turn it into something precious. Okay, so there is value, okay, in creating connectivity and creating data synergies and creating sharing. Just think about, one example. Think about a smart city, which attempts to efficiently set traffic flows depending on real-time information, and it needs to combine information, real-time information from numerous sensors and data sources along the routes. Now, how does this affect competition? So, on the one hand, it might significantly increase competition. And part of the reason is because much of the data is collected and organized in a system that is largely modular and distributed. For example, even today, we already have about 30 billion IoT devices, which are controlled by numerous market players, and they're all hooked to the internet. And this is, of course, in addition to other forms of data collection. However, those who collect the data are not necessarily the ones who can benefit from it. And when combined with other data, its value might increase exponentially. Accordingly, if we allow faster and cheaper connectivity, that could better enable firms to share data. And by widening the use of data, it enables cumulative and synergetic knowledge production, which may stimulate new and better products and processes. Also, by expanding the potential uses of data and facilitating data integration, this increases the incentives to collect data and might increase competition over data collection, where we think that this is a good thing. However, it might also, so I've now talked about some positive effects. Let me talk about some effects that raise some concerns, okay? And I've been asked to, this seminar is about the big tech companies. So let's ask, what might 5G, what benefits might it create for big players that might affect competition? So one main concern involves the better enablement of this better connectivity of the creation of what I call data ecosystems. Now, what are data ecosystems? Data ecosystems are internal or external arrangements that allow for the sharing of data among different units or entities. Every market player can, of course, create a data ecosystem, but we are going to look at the advantages they create for the big players. And the reason is that their starting point and their current data-based advantages might further strengthen existing advantages that others cannot match, even if they create their own data ecosystems. So, and indeed, we see more data ecosystems created by these large firms that build upon their existing advantages. And they are created in a multitude of markets, including smart homes, including medical devices. Some might be internal or created by mergers. For example, Amazon's merger with Ring or Google's bid for Fitbit that has raised a lot of questions. And some of them might also be external, where one of the big tech companies joins forces with another company. And let me start by saying that these joint ventures or these data ecosystems have a lot of benefits for consumers. Okay, it's not that, I mean, many of them are bring about increase in welfare, but at the same time, they create competitive concerns, and they might even strengthen some of the competitive concerns that we are already aware of. So to make this point, let me use an example. And the example I chose for you today is the example of a joint venture between Sanofi and Google. Okay, this was a joint venture that was approved by the Commission a few years ago. So what is this joint venture? This is a very important one. It offers a virtual diabetes clinic, and it provides services for the management and treatment of diabetes by real-time monitoring of a patient's bodily conditions and medication, and creating suggestions. What Google offers here is a platform where the data is then processed and analyzed, and in order to create personal recommendations based on the patient's data. So in the first step, this joint venture will engage in data collection and processing and storage and analysis in the display. But as it develops, it would offer supplementary products such as insulin pumps and insurance and dietary plans. Okay, so of course, undoubtedly, such a joint venture creates value. It overcomes data collection barriers, for example. It reduces duplication of collection costs while increasing the reuse of data in this ecosystem. It might create internal data synergies, for example, by combining data to create economies of scale and scope, and it enables a holistic and better treatment of people who have diabetes, extremely important, of course. It creates economies of scope and data services. You can actually see your data regarding your diabetes and how and your bodily measurements in one place. It also creates economies of scope in related services. For example, if the data on your situation suggests X, then an insurance can be fitted to your own situation, for example. So, as I said, there are many, many benefits that can come out of these data ecosystems. However, they can also create competitive concern. And one of the reasons is because this is a single gateway business model. And the concern is that the joint venture might create comparative advantages and control substantial parts of the relevant markets, many markets, the markets that are connected in this joint venture due to database advantages, and create entry barriers for others into all related markets. Another risk, of course, is the risk of exploitation and abuse due to these strong ecosystem positions. There's a trade-off between the benefits and harms that mandates an analysis which takes into account what we have learned about how data markets operate. And let me emphasize, I'm not arguing at all that this specific joint venture should not have been approved. I am saying that when we analyze it and when we think about them, the analysis should not be simplistic, like the Commission's analysis in this case, at least seems to me. When we analyze them, we have to take into account what we know about data markets. So, for example, one question would be, how important are data and data analytics to this specific business? What kind of data are necessary for competition in that market? How high are the barriers to its collection, to its storage, to its analysis? And the analysis needs to be market specific and not based on general assumptions of data markets. Just to give you an example here, one of the concerns that was raised in this case was the possibility of locking in patients to the services of the joint venture, thereby potentially reducing competition. And the parties argued that the platform and the devices are designed such that users will be free to use any services with that it offers with third-party products. So it created interoperability. So you can actually use any insulin pump to connect. And that, in the way that the analysis went, solved the competition problem. However, it doesn't solve the competition problem, I argue. Why? Because the core of the matter is that although the interoperability is two-directional, the flow of information is one-directional. Okay, so you can connect everything, but the data comes from these insulin pumps, from your Fitbit, from whatever, into one system. Okay, it creates stronger advantages for that system. And this is something that has to be taken into account. Okay, I have some more a few more points about the GDPR, but we can talk about them later. Thank you.
I think we properly set the floor for Johan, that now can tell us the point of view of Facebook, which is of course a protagonist, an absolute protagonist of the new digital environment. Please, Johan.
Thank you, Federico, for your kind words also in the introduction, and thanks for having me here in Florence, even though virtual. And I'm glad to be back in Florence and also to be invited in my new capacity at Facebook, because the last time I was speaking at the Florence School of Regulation, I was still a regulator and a colleague of Antonio in the European space. So I joined Facebook almost 3 years ago. Time moves fast if you are working in this world. And I think it will be interesting to reflect a little bit on both Antonio's as well as Mikael's very interesting interventions. But maybe first start by explaining a little bit what I'm doing within Facebook and why we are participating in a discussion about 5G in the first place, because I can imagine that people are thinking of Facebook as a service provider, which we are, of course, as we have Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram as the most famous services. And why would we care about these kind of technological developments? I will explain that shortly. So my role within Facebook is that I'm the policy lead for the EMEA region, so not only Europe, but also the Middle East and Africa in the connectivity and accessibility space, and also deal to some extent with all the competition discussions, for instance, like in Europe. And I think that Mikael explained already very important trade-offs in that debate. So I'm involved in the discussions also around DSA and DMA at the European level, which are also part of the broader discussion, I guess, that Antonio and Mikael spoke about. So happy also to speak briefly about that and also to take questions later on that. But maybe first talk a little bit about the connectivity in Facebook and why we care about all these kind of developments in 5G. Maybe it's good to reflect a little bit on what Antonio said in the first part of his intro, speaking about the COVID pandemic and the need for digital inclusiveness and not to have people being at the wrong side of the digital divide. And I think the example in Italy is clear, but sadly enough, there are many other countries and even other regions where people are less connected. And of course, Facebook, as everyone knows, we are a global company and our services are offered almost at a global scale. So we don't only care about our European users, but also about the other regions. And I think it's interesting from my perspective to see how, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the Middle East, we deal with connectivity issues. But I think it's important here to explain that Facebook cares about connectivity for obvious reasons, because it's beneficial for Facebook products, of course, but also because we believe in connectivity and in people giving the power to connect and to speak and communicate. It's part of a mission, but I think it's much broader than just a Facebook mission. So we put a lot of effort in that space. And the way we do that, I think that's important for people to know, is that we work very closely together with hundreds of partners globally, typically telcos, but also other partners in the technology domain. So we don't want to step into the space of an ISP, for instance, but we do collaborate with them because we have a lot of smart people back in the US and in the regions, and they develop technologies which are also applicable in the environment that the ISPs and the telcos are working, and also in the 5G environment. Typically, Facebook, we are technology agnostic, so we don't favor one technology per se above another, but we care about connectivity. And we are also not in favor of one ISP above another. We work together with all the ISPs who we can help, or where we can work together to bring more people online. And it's not only about connectivity, it's also about affordability, because even if there's sometimes coverage in a region, people need to be able to pay for it. And also, sadly enough, here we see that quite often it's hard for some people living from paycheck to be able to connect properly. So we have a bunch of initiatives in this space. We've got a separate website. It's connectivity.fb.com, but I'm happy to connect with people afterwards also to give them a little bit more directions to what we're doing in this space. So that's the heart of the mission, and that's why we care about all the topics that we just discussed. If you zoom a little bit more into the 5G discussions, we are not a very important player at this stage, of course, in the 5G debate. It's more with the telcos and with the infrastructure providers, of course. But we do want to stimulate connectivity and 5G developments. So we have set up a couple of initiatives together with other companies, and I will mention briefly two of them here. One is the TIP project. It's called TIP Telecom Infra Project. And once again, I can direct people afterwards to the website and the initiatives we have there. There we have like hundreds of companies. All the companies you know in this space, I guess, will be there working on the connectivity challenges globally. That's one thing. The other recent development, which is taking place also as part of TIP, but also as a separate coalition, is in the Open RAN area. And I think this relates to some of the things that Antonio said earlier, because there we advocate for open standards and technologies, which is extremely important in the 5G space, especially because you have more software-based opportunities to use. And we believe, together with our partners, that we should stimulate open software and hardware protocols to stimulate the development in that debate, making the rollout of 5G networks more affordable for the telcos, and in the end, ultimately also for the users. And that will make connectivity better for end users globally. I think this is one of the areas that we are very busy working on. I think in the EU, of course, which is way more connected, luckily, despite the examples that Antonio gave, but it's better connected than many other regions. We still work on a couple of issues also to connect rural areas, and we have technologies like Terragraph, which we deploy with sometimes very small operators to be able to connect small villages in the rural areas. But we are also supporting better Wi-Fi, and it's not often a part of the discussions that we see on panels like these, but I think it's important to mention that here too, because I think that many people right now are using Wi-Fi to connect. I'm doing it myself. And sometimes it's a bit of a hiccup, and especially at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where we were monitoring together with the telcos whether the networks would hold, which was luckily the case. But it was very important to see how the different usage patterns of the people at home people working like this, but also the people at the same time Netflixing, etc. Whether this would hold. Also, by the way, we worked pretty good together with governments, the telco industry, and other tech companies. And at some point, we decided to slow down the video traffic with all the companies involved to be able to better cope with the traffic load. I think it's a good example how we jointly could deal with the challenges of the COVID. By now, I think it's not necessary anymore, but I think it's a good way to show how quick, because this was set up quite quickly in a couple of weeks, how quick we could act there together. But I think the Wi-Fi example is important because if you look into the future and 5G, actually, I don't see that Wi-Fi is a substitute for 5G. I think it's a complement, because you need the Wi-Fi offload also for 5G to perform well, and that together with the increased usage at home, but also in offices, etc., and the new technologies which will also come from IoT, but also from AR, VR kind of applications where we are quite active ourselves as a company. I think it's very important that we get more spectrum for Wi-Fi, unlicensed spectrum, and in the US, the FCC has taken a step already, and in the EU, we are discussing this right now, and I'm pretty optimistic that we will free a little bit more spectrum too, also to facilitate Wi-Fi. But I think if you look at the whole connectivity value chain, especially in Europe, it's also important to take the Wi-Fi component into account. Maybe if you allow me a couple of comments on Michael's point about competition and the data economy, because I'm aware, of course, that Facebook is very active in all the data discussions and the DMA and the DSA discussions in Europe right now. I can totally echo what Michael said about the Google example and the trade-offs that you need to take into account when assessing a merger, but also when looking at markets more generally. I will pause here. I think there are examples in this space where I can say something from the Facebook perspective, but I'm also conscious of time, as I don't want to steal everything from the others. I would like you, Federico, and the other people attending to ask questions.
Please, Johan, if you want to elaborate a little bit more, I don't see any question yet from the floor. So if you want to talk about the issue raised by Michael of the data accumulation.
I think Antonio mentioned also that the Data Governance Act and the data sharing initiatives by the public bodies, which of course is very important. And I think that on the private side, it's important too, you know, and that you don't have like abuse of dominance position, of course, in the data economy. In that sense, it's not different from any other economy. And I'm fully aware that we are at the heart of the debate, and it's of course in the DMA plans, especially, which will be published in a couple of weeks. I expect we will see a little bit more from the European institutions, and we have submitted a contribution to that consultation, of course, too. And I think that data sharing can be very beneficial for a whole ecosystem and also for competition. But of course, there's always a trade-off, first of all, between competition and privacy. We have a bit of experience in that space. Actually, if you look at the privacy issues we had in the past, for instance, with Cambridge Analytica, in fact, it came from an API kind of scheme we had where other companies were allowed to share data with us. So there, maybe naively at that time, we believed that it was good for other companies as well as for ourselves to share data. But then at that time, we ran into the privacy issues, obviously. But still, we have developed an initiative where we are sharing data between companies, and it's free for other companies to join. And we are in favor of doing more of data sharing activities, but we should be careful, of course, by the different stakes here. And I think that Michael explained a couple of them, because I think that it's not only privacy, you also need to carefully analyze whether it's pro-competitive if you impose certain data obligations. And I think many of us here have experience also in the telco industry, and sometimes we tend to take the the telco-related views on interoperability and data portability to the platform world. And I think it's a totally different world. And I don't say this in a defensive way, because I think it's an important subject that we need to talk about, what is possible, but we should also take into account whether some of the effects are pro-competition or could have as a backlash that it would be unnecessary anti-competition, because I see those risks too. Because if you have a big ecosystem, by allowing others to tap into the data sets of that company, you could create an even bigger ecosystem where smaller companies become dependent on the bigger ones, and they will form some kind of conglomerate that might have as a whole unwanted anti-competitive effects. So I think it's something you cannot predict in advance, of course, but I think that what Mikael said, that by assessing something, for instance, a merger, but also a market, then you should take all these angles into account.
Please, Mikael and Antonio, I don't know if you want to say something about. Please, Mikael.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Johan. It seems that we are in agreement, and it's great. And of course, I think that the devil is in the details. I would say that abuse in platform markets might be a bit different because of the tipping effects. Not so many other markets that have tipping effects that are so strong as we might find them in some of the platform markets. So the concern for for dominance for over a long time might be different, for example, than in the telecom markets or others. I think it's a point that we have to think about. Now, I am Federica. I see that there's a question for. Can I answer that?
Yes, for you, indeed.
Okay.
From Igor.
Sure. Okay. So the question is that if data sharing is a remedy for competitive concerns, how do we reconcile it with privacy concerns and GDPR requirements? I believe consumers would not be happy of having their personal data circulating to every company in the industry. That is a great question. Really, it's a wonderful question. Thank you, Igor, for this. Let me give you a few pointers of what I think. First of all, I think you're right. I think that data sharing should definitely be limited by the GDPR or any other regulation that protects. It's not only privacy, it's human dignity. It's much more deeper than privacy itself. So I agree here. So what do we do with regard to sharing? There's several things that can be done here in order to remedy the competitive concerns. One of them is to require consent, just like is required in the GDPR, put it in the system, require that, enable the user to give consent to different firms, not only one, maybe multi consent, but just make sure that he agrees to that. A second one, and this comes from an article that I've written with Nicolas Petit from EUI, is that what we suggest is called radical remedies for the digital world. What we say is, because sharing data is problematic sometimes because of exactly, Igor, what you've mentioned, then what we suggest is that at least in some instances, if the algorithm learned from data that was anti-competitively collected, the algorithm should be shared and not the data. And then you don't see the personal information, but you get the learning. So you create the competitive effect. Thanks.
Just, Igor, I think it's a great question too. I'll be brief, but I dropped something in the answer box to your question with Facebook's view and our position on the trade-offs.
Yeah, maybe may I add something to this question, and because it's very complex, and I think that one of the issues that will be developed in the DMA and also DSA, etc., is precisely this relationship between data and algorithms. And I think that the European Commission will just overcome this distinction, just going to a definition that is not based on the product, or is not based on the let me say on the facility. So it's not specifying data, it's not specifying algorithms, it's just specifying the effects. So they are going to define this gatekeeper notion that somehow is the evolution of the old essential facility doctrine applied to telcos, and has not to do with an essential facility asset, so data or algorithms, but has to do with the ability to exert an economic power. And I'm stressing economic power because even here, there is, I think, the attempt to go beyond the definition of market power. So trying to focus on the role of big tech as intermediaries. Now, here there is certainly this trade-off between sharing and privacy, and I understand as an economist the fundamental value that privacy is trying to protect, but I also see the paradox that in some case, we can talk here about Facebook because Johan is here, but we can talk about several other platforms. It is true that through exclusivity, that through privacy, somehow you can enhance exclusivity. Now, what exclusivity means is exclusivity coming from the value, not of the single data, but from the value of the volume and variety and scope of the data. Here, I think that a very interesting concept is the one that has been raised by Acemoglu and others when they focus on these information leakages. So that what they believe is that once you have a high volume, when you have an algorithm with machine learning, the algorithm is much more able to put value on all the kind of information that is produced, the larger is the database. And because it allows to have clusters of type of individuals that shares common characteristics and features, so that you can increase the value of each single behavior in order to make prediction. Now, this behavior, on the one side, it is very efficient. It allows platforms to produce more efficient services to the final consumers. But on the other side, precisely because it is efficient, somehow it is also enhancing the first mover advantage, even if there is a strong competition among platforms. So here we are really in a complex world, but what I would like to focus to is the second part of Igor's questions, when I think, on my point of view, the solution, and this is why I mentioned the DGA, is that we have to think to data as property rights, not only as personal unalienable rights, and try to imagine data intermediaries that could somehow enhance the economic value of our single data when put together in order to coordinate collective action. Because one of the main points and sources of economic advantages of platforms is coming not from their ability to have an economic advantage per se, which is the result of innovation, but the exit cost and the coordination cost for exiting by each single users of the platform, which is somehow related to network effects. Because once you have that kind of exit costs and cost of coordinating collective action, for instance, to exit from one platform, it's very difficult to use the market as a discipline device against market power. So, I mean, it's a very complex environment. I think we need to progress a little bit on privacy rules, in order to understand how we can use data and algorithms access or sharing or whatever in order to have a much more balanced evolution of markets. It's difficult, but...
So thank you very much. I got some interesting takeaways from your presentation. Antonio spoke about the digital ecosystem. which, as Johan rightly pointed out, is not only composed by traditional mobile operators, but also by fixed operators, because of course we see an increasing use of instance of FWA technologies in order to provide connectivity over the territory. We have seen at least in Italy, but I guess also in other countries, the spread out of small cells technologies and so on. So there is, there is a tendency, I would say, a convergence between fixed and mobile network operators in order to provide the underlying connectivity which is needed to transfer more data. Mikael talk about a data puzzle where a lot of participants play. For instance, we mentioned also the role of public institutions that gather a lot of data, that possess a huge amount of data that maybe useful in order to provide a level playing field, for instance, to new entrants, because of course if they can access at least the data which are possessed by the public services, thinking about hospital, whatever, they can probably build upon solid grounds their offer. And then you want talk about data portability and the privacy issues, as Igor rightly pointed out. So there are a lot of issues here, and you know that in Europe we have now a debate of a new competition toolkit and so on. At the end, what do you think? It will be enough to rely on traditional antitrust law, or we need a more ex-ante regulation in order to take account and to balance all these conflicting interests? Because of course, on the one hand, data sharing is good competition, but it's bad for privacy, for the individual freedom to be let alone, as Judge Brandeis put back in the history. So so the final question for you is, what do you think? Shall we continue as business as usual, or shall we enter in a new phase of regulatory intervention?
Who do you want to go first, Federico?
But probably Mikael. Ladies first.
I definitely think we should go, that we should do something. We've learned a lot in the past 5 years. I remember when I was writing, 5 years ago, there were some basic assumptions that nobody understood about the data market. Now we know more, thanks to people like Antonio Nisita and others, have studied these markets. And I think that antitrust is sometimes too slow, and it's a little bit too late. And sometimes, justice postponed is justice denied. Okay, and I think that definitely we should think about new regulations. However, we should be very, very careful. Yesterday, we had a discussion about no-fault monopoly regulation. Sometimes I think that some of what is suggested goes much too far than it should have gone. And I think we have to think carefully about our assumptions, what we want to gain, how we can make sure that we don't lose the benefits that these data ecosystems bring, while at the same time, limiting harm, whether it be to privacy, to human dignity, or to competition, or to security.
Please, Antonio.
Yes, just to say that I agree with Mikael, and personally, I think that this huge debate we had in the past years over reforming antitrust competences is somehow a little bit misled, because antitrust, if you look very recently, we had different, at least 3 cases, for instance, against Google in the European Union. One case just recently opened by the Department of Justice in the US, even one case opened in Italy. And all these kind of cases have been opened at the existing level of legislation, precisely in the same period in which we had several discussions on how to reforming antitrust laws So my point is much more that we had, precisely for the reasons that Michael has outlined, we had in the past a sort of under-enforcement in terms of antitrust, but not because antitrust decided not to perform their competencies, but simply because the world was changing too fast, and we had to really understand the pace and the race of innovation, and in order to understand what markets means in a multi-sided markets that are intermediated by platforms, we need to understand what is the value of data, we need to understand what is the value of innovation, etc., etc. Also, we need to understand that many of these markets became global, so that we also maybe need a sort of coordination at the international level among the different antitrust authorities. So what I think it is a new field of antitrust intervention that maybe need to be renewed is the control of the mergers, simply because we have introduced some threshold, simply because we come from a tradition of thought for which we look at overlap of market shares, while when we look at the data, the issue is not the overlap of market share, but enhancing the economic power through different sources of data that become to be exclusive. So I think that while some innovation in terms of merger control is needed and welcome, on the other, I think that antitrust has all the competencies and powers to do its own job. But what we need is to have some regulation, which means legal certainty on several issues. And now I think that platforms fully agree with that. So we need certainty both at some horizontal level for what is the notion of illegal content somehow, but also in terms of what are the duties for big tech. Here, what I see is the only analogy with the telcos world in the past is maybe to distinguish between some platforms that have some minimum dimension against all the other platforms. That is something that, for instance, the Gdpr cannot do. And what I see here is some ideas of horizontal regulation on some general behavior, and to give powers and competencies for audit and investigating information related to algorithms to the regulatory authorities. I am a little bit less sure that, for instance, the approach that will be in the DMA, because it is somehow taken by the UK experience that has been announced by CMA on having antitrust starting investigations and then setting remedies for single issues. I think it could be too broad, because you start the investigation without knowing precisely where you are going to do. And maybe you can come with remedies when it's too late relative to the economic problems that you want to set out. So I believe that maybe we should put much more effort to understand what kind of light regulation we want to introduce, for instance, on accessibility, for instance, on exclusivity of many economic activities that platforms are developing. And for instance, all these Google decisions were precisely on the fact that due to the advantage of knowing some features of data, Google was able to develop a new business model and new markets on an exclusivity basis. So there are several ways in which we can think and enforce and define some regulation, but I think it's much more time of clarity and legal certainty through a new standard of regulation rather than pushing much more on antitrust. Antitrust has all the competencies and powers to intervene in any case on the special responsibility of dominant firms.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we are getting short of time. We just received a very interesting question with point of view from Professor Manganelli, which I think deserves an entire webinar. It's on the limit of consent versus property rights over data as a mean to grant a better control of citizens over their data. So, Johan, we have just a few seconds for your conclusion, your final remarks on competition.
I'll try to do it in 2 seconds. I'll be brief because I think that both Mikael and Antonio made some very sensible comments already. And I would always say that I would love if more people in some areas in Europe would use the same approach. But I think that the discussion sometimes is a bit too much politicized, which is maybe normal at this stage of the negotiation. So we have to accept that. But what I hope, regulation is coming. We have been anticipating that. We have even been supportive of regulation. I think definitely in the DSA part, of course, but also the DMA part, we expect that there is something to happen. The one thing I really hope is that I agree with Antonio that antitrust is a sort of baseline, and that on top of that, there's probably need for something else. But the one thing I really hope is that anything that will be in the DMA will be still harms-based and will include also proportionality mechanisms, because sometimes in the current debate, I see that there's a blacklisting, etc., without any evidence of harm even being put in there. And I think at all times we should make sure that there's a trade-off between the benefits. And I think the example that Mikael gave earlier, explaining the trade-offs, I think you always need to have trade-offs between all the positives that come with tech companies and platforms, or so-called gatekeepers. And the other thing is that we should be cautious by not earmarking just a few companies as gatekeepers and then ignoring what's happening just at the other side of those who are not gatekeepers, because it's a whole industry, and it's not only the tech companies using those data. It's a fact of life that any company, whether it's automotive, whether it's traditional economies in the financial sector, moving into this space already since years. So we should be aware of the broader trends, which is a fact of life. That's my last comment.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with you that we underestimate the risk of false positives, which can lead to an overregulation, over-intervention. I think that, Chiara, I ask you that the webinar is over now.
Yes, we can close the webinar. Thank you so much to all of you for this very interesting debate. Last word to you, Federico.
So thank you very much for your participation and for this lively discussion. I think we have much more to think about in our next future, thanks to this webinar. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.